All right, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural show of Citizen Sane. I am Guy Weddle, and I'm here with the illustrious, beautiful, crazy, insane Dr. Christie.
Hello, world. Woo!
Well, finally, huh? Here we
yeah,
are.
Absolutely. Years of procrastination, and we finally did it.
And today we have Frank C. Feschino, Jr. He is the author of The Braxton County Monster. This is a revised edition from 2012. The original, I guess, the publisher fucked up in 2004 or whatever, and I've been reading it, and it is phenomenal. We also have Alfred Lindbergh, who is here with us, and two of my favorite people, one of my most favorite researched cases. It has been, this isn't an armchair research type situation to where somebody goes out on the internet and they just go out and get stuff. Frank went out, was hands-on, walked the walk with the people, took the Air Force clippings, went, just really drilled down and spent, 20 years, Frank?
Yeah, closer to 21 now. But, yeah, I spent a lot of time in West Virginia. And I can add, too, that Mr. Lindbergh spent some time up in West Virginia with me as well. And he was actually one of the few researchers who actually was on the Bailey Fisher farm and went to the different sites where this occurred. So hats off to Al Lindbergh. He's one of the few that has stuck behind me on this whole case over the years.
Yeah, man. Al, how about you still around that meth midget bar down there?
we have to go there, do we? Come on, man.
We got to.
No, I think that place burned down. Actually, there was some crazy bald-headed guy that just went crazy, from what I understand, and he torched the place. But apart from that. Yeah, Joe Nichols was down there. Joe Nichols was down there. But at any rate, I really appreciate Frank's description of me. It's not entirely accurate. I'm certainly not a researcher, but I'll tell you what, I have been up there. I have talked to the people. I've been impressed with their sincerity and their courage and their general intelligence. They can't be written off as hillbillies when they tell a cogent story and are able to slap a decent sentence together. And like I say, I'm impressed with their sincerity, and it's a hell of a tale.
We actually talked about that the other day, didn't we? The fact that the people, sort of have these really good throwaway excuses, like, it was the 50s, they didn't know what they were looking at. They kind of refer to them as if they were almost of the same intellect as Cro-Magnon man, and it's really not the case, is it? I mean, in the 50s we had all kinds of technology going on, and so, they definitely... if they're going to all describe the same thing in the same way, then there's no mistaking it. I would love to know what it was.
Well, the thing is, Frank's kind of put it together.
Yeah. So, Frank, why don't you take us back from the beginning of why you got involved in the case and that sort of thing? I'm sure you've said this like 1,000 times, but if you could humor our audience.
I have some relatives that live in Braxton County, and at the time actually lived in Frametown, which is about 17 miles away from Flatwoods. And as we'll talk about this a little bit later, Frametown actually came into play during my research. There was another incident that happened the night after the Flatwoods Monster incident. But I was up there over 20 years ago, and I was visiting my cousin, and we had a death in the family. I ended up going back up to West Virginia, to Braxton County again. And early on, Guy, I started talking to some of the locals up there, and they would talk about the flying saucers and UFO sightings up there like the guys would talk about on Monday morning talking about the football scores. It was just very common. And I started getting phone calls from my cousin up in Braxton County and some of the other locals about all of these crop circles, rings that were appearing throughout Braxton County, and several of them were on my cousin's farm, right in the area of James Knoll, which was a key part of the Flatwoods Monster incident. But anyways, the stuff is still going on up there today as far as UFO sightings, crop circle rings, and I was actually put in touch with Colin Andrews years ago. I started documenting these crop circle rings. I lived in Connecticut at the time, and Colin came over from England, and we met in Connecticut and sat down for a couple hours. I gave him my video footage that I had taken to the farm, and soil samples, different things pieces that he could use for his research. And during the early part of that research, it just fascinated me seeing this stuff and listening to the stories that the locals were telling me. It was kind of kept inside the community. They didn't talk outside of that community too much about what was going on there. And during that point, within about the first year that I started going into Braxton County, that's when I found out about the Braxton County monster. Somebody told me through a newspaper article, actually in the Braxton Democrat. And I went into town with my cousin. We were actually on the way going back out of state. And I said, well, let's stop by. It's not that far away. And it was only just a few minutes up the road, and we pulled into the town. And bordering to the right-hand side of the road, there's a gigantic wooden sign, "Welcome to Flatwoods, home of the Green Monster." And I went into the town, tried talking to a couple people. They were kind of standoffish about it. Not too much happened. Then when I got back home to Connecticut, I started looking into this story just out of curiosity. And over the next few months, I started realizing through all the newspaper articles that I was able to find, all the old UFO books and magazines, I was going to libraries all over the state, that this story had really turned into a joke over the years, and there was not two stories in any book that were alike. All the stories were different. I would read one book, and it said, Kathleen made a primary witness, and there was 2 kids, there was 5 kids, there was 12 kids, there was 4 kids, and I'm like, this story is crazy. And then when I saw what this monster looked like, I actually thought it was a joke. That's the old picture that you see of the monster wearing the KKK hood, this big black hood coming to a point. He's wearing a dress with arms and claws, with bulging eyes, with this big round head, basically similar to a monk's outfit. And this thing was floating. And that right there, as far as I was concerned, that was kind of ridiculous. Well, I started going back.
It turned me off right off the bat, I can tell you. Not to interrupt, Frank, but it just totally turned me off. A Forrest Nixie with a big round pumpkin head wearing a Sweet 16 skirt. Now, come on. I mean, who can believe that? But please continue.
And this story is these different stories that I was reading about. It's like, how come this story is so botched up? Later on, I came to find out that this was one of the biggest news stories in the world in 1952. And I was thinking to myself, how could a story of this magnitude get this screwed up? Something happened here. So I started going into the town and talking to different people. And I was put in touch with the primary witness, Kathleen May. And I spoke to her on the phone quite a few times, and she started telling me a different story from what I was reading in the books. And what actually happened with this ridiculous drawing is that a couple of the witnesses actually went on a nationwide television show a week after the incident. It was called We the People. And the witnesses sat down with a sketch artist, and they were giving their descriptions to the artist. And this was right before the show. He did this pencil drawing on a poster board of what this monster. It was actually his interpretation. I can't blame the artist 100% because the witnesses had never seen anything like this in their lives. This thing was completely out of this world. And they're trying to describe what this thing looked like, and the artist, through his interpretation, drew this ridiculous picture of a monster wearing a dress. Yeah. I started working with Kathleen May, and she told me a different story. And she gave me the description. Being an illustrator, I was able to basically do police-style renderings, like sitting down with the witnesses.
And that was, too, described as what Frank Feschino ended up painting was described from the very beginning. It never was a Forrest Nixie with a pumpkin head and a Sweet 16 skirt. It's what Frank drew.
Right, and what happened from that point, working with Kathleen, I ended up talking to her son, Freddie May, and I conversed on the phone with Freddie several times. I met with him, and Freddie actually took me up to the spot where this whole event occurred. And it was really cool to be able to go through with an actual witness. Freddie May actually saw the craft fly over the school playground that night. He ran up to the house. To his house. Kathleen was his mom. He was with his brother and a bunch of neighborhood kids. There was a bunch of dogs there. They all went up onto the farm. Freddie actually walked me step by step by step by step from beginning to end, and then back to the house after the encounter occurred. So I was able to get an exact feeling for what actually happened that night. And the farm since then has been fixed up into a dude ranch. It doesn't look anything like it did when I started going up there 20 years ago. And I have video footage of all of my eyewitness interviews. Then as I would go up there throughout the years, I would walk through with my camera, walk through the whole mile stretch and go to the different points. So I have video footage of what this farm actually looked like. Back then, it hadn't changed much since then.
Yeah, is everybody appreciating the significance of video footage of the key witnesses? And I'll tell you, now that is astonishing. And anybody who thinks they can whack it out in one place, it's in 2 or 3 places, folks. So it can't go away. Frank's got that forever.
Yeah, it's like, to be honest with you, when I first heard of this case years ago, I saw the Pumpkinhead rendering and all that stuff, and I just wrote it off.
Me
I
too.
didn't actually take this case serious until, I started looking at Frank's work.
Well, the good thing with Freddie May is I was able to walk through, and I got a feeling really good for what had happened there, and I understood it a lot better. And I was actually videotaping this step by step. And then I sat down with Freddie. Freddie was a few feet away from this whole, from the incident that had unfolded. Kathleen May was with her other son, Edison. We call him Eddie. And a couple of the other boys that were up there, and an adult, Gene Lemon. This thing came right out, which it actually was a machine. It was like a metallic, it was like a hovercraft, like a portable spacesuit. And Freddie saw it from a few feet back. So when I was working with Kathleen, I had an up-close and personal description of what this monster, we're going to call it a monster for namesake, what the Flatwoods monster looked like up close. She told me it came to within about 14 feet of her, which is pretty close. Freddie was set back down the path a few feet. He saw the whole scene unfold in front of him. So by being an artist, I was able to sit down and establish my illustrations. And we started out with thumbnail sketches. And actually in the book I have one of the original thumbnail sketches. I sat down with Freddie, and I would hand a pencil to him, and he did a sketch, and he says, well, Frank, you're better at this. It looked like this, this, and that. And before you know it, we had this working drawing. And I'm like, this looks absolutely nothing like what the original thing looked like. What Kathleen May was trying to describe to the sketch artist, the lower portion of it, and this is a very big misconception, was the draped cloth lower torso of the body. Mrs. May had never seen anything like this, and we're going to call it. It was a craft, basically, a hovercraft. The lower portion of it was flared out. Freddie told me it was about 4 feet wide, and it had pipes. And as I was sitting there, I remember him putting his arm out in front of him, and he said, Frank, those pipes that went around the lower torso were about as thick as my arm, similar to a fireman's hose. And he held his arm out. He said they went all around the lower portion of it. This thing was hovering, If you look at the original drawing close, the one thing that the artist did get correct was he put in a drop cast shadow, which was his simulation of it hovering. So this kind of added the mystery to the whole thing. Why is this ridiculous-looking monster in a dress with arms and claws floating? Why is it floating above the ground? When I sat down with Kathleen and Freddie, and later on I actually met Eddie May, and I met Ronald Shaver, and I talked to Neil Nunley, who was another primary witness right up front. He came within a few feet of the monster. The reason there was a drop cast shadow drawn in there is because this thing was a hovercraft, and it was propelling itself, and it was hovering off the ground. The sulfur smell and the gas that was in the area was coming from the exhaust of these pipes. This thing was a machine that was hovering. So you could see how, if you actually look at the illustrations that I was able to come up with from the descriptions of the witnesses instead of this half-assed drawing that was done in minutes right before the TV show, and they turned it around on this national television show and bang, put it in front of the camera. The music got loud and they played all this creepy music, and everybody just kind of looked at each other and said, what's this? But when you take the time and you sit down with the witnesses like I did, I was able to come up with the actual closer likeness to what this thing looked like. And as far as the big pointed cloth hood that was over its head, Kathleen and Freddie told me it was actually an outer helmet, and it was black, and it came to a point. The head was not a head made of flesh. It was actually an inner helmet. And Freddie likened the whole scenario to this as like looking at a fighter pilot sitting inside the cockpit. You're looking down over the canopy. This thing basically, the upper portion of it was like a cockpit. He said that it had what looked like a sheet of glass, some type of protective barrier or shield in front of it. Mrs. May said that the head was actually would like rotate where the collar was. In the original drawing, it showed like a little V-neck, almost like a little tie, and the head was actually turning. And this was actually like a spacesuit. And the upper portion in the drawing made it look like a tunic top. It was basically flat aluminum gray metal, and the whole thing was a little bit narrow at the top where the shoulders were, and then it flared out like a booster rocket. As far as the arms and the claws, those scary protrusions that were coming out, Kathleen and Freddie told me they looked like antenna coming off of the plane of the shoulders. And in the original descriptions of the monster that Kathleen May had given that was in the press the first couple days, the original stories, she said they look like little hands, which they were a combination of like small little antennas. When we sat down, I drew these sketches. And what they did is they took these hands, they put long arms on them, they turned it into a monster. So what you have here is actually a nearly 12-foot tall metallic-like hovercraft. They were able to establish its height by the tree limb that it was under. It was hovering next to a white oak tree that was over 100 feet tall. When Mrs. May flashed the flashlight onto this craft, it lit up from the inside. Gene Lemon, who was standing nearby, actually flashed his light shortly after. It was about dusk, and the thing lit up from the inside. Kathleen May said it glowed from the inside.
And everybody needs to remember that, too. In addition to lighting up like a freaking Christmas tree, people had flashlights on this thing. And this is important to remember when we start talking about barn owls later on.
Yeah.
And
with
one
big
time,
scary arms.
one thing I was talking about with Freddie, and this was a good likeness. It's like looking at your car at night when you turn it on and your dashboard lights come out and you can see the glow from within the car. That's what he compared it to. It actually lit up from the inside. And the fable tale about it was shooting laser beams and shooting beams of light from its eyes, it's purely science fiction. What the witnesses told me is when this thing lit up from the inside, it glowed, and the light was forced out of the eye openings. They weren't eyes. The witnesses distinctly told me they looked like portholes. This was a helmet. There was something inside of here. And where these big eyes were, the openings, because this lit up from the inside, it was a machine. It was basically like a cockpit. When the inside of this lit up, the light forced out of the eye openings. They were weak beams of light that shot out. They weren't laser beams. So there we have the myth of the monster and how one illustration has botched up the history books for all of these years.
Yeah, that's all it takes. I mean, did it look damaged at all or anything, or?
Pardon?
Did it look damaged at all, or?
Well, Mrs. May told me in one of my interviews, Guy, she said when she came up into the area, the smoke, there was like this smoke and sulfur mist, and it was actually rolling down the hill area, and it was coming up from ahead of them to the left. As they came around this little swag and this dirt path, and it was a dirt path that's cut up into the woods, she heard noises that sounded like frying bacon. And I said, Kathleen, what do you mean by frying bacon? She says, well, when you have a bunch of grease and oil in a frying pan and it's crackling and it's sizzling, she said it sounded like something crackling and sizzling. And she said, in addition, she heard this noise that sounded like a low, thumping, rhythmic beat. And she said it sounded like a piece of stretched canvas, like a drum, if you had dropped a coin onto it, thud, thud. And she says that was rhythmic. And she heard this noise, and as they got closer to where this oak tree was, and that's when they cast the flashlights into that area, that's when the thing lit up from the inside. Well, as it was moving towards them, it was splattering oil and shooting this, we're going to say, it was like an oily substance. And this oily substance splattered throughout the whole area, and it hit the front of Mrs. May's uniform. She was a beautician, and they had uniforms back in the day. And this oil completely splattered the whole front of her. The farm was covered in the oil. So it does look like this thing was damaged. It was leaking. I don't think this thing was supposed to be splattering this substance out all over the place. And it seemed to be hot. Something was frying up from the sounds of what Mrs. May was talking about. This thing
and then on the other hand, that gas or whatever it was could be just the kind of thing that you might cast off trying to keep the Gomers away,
Could have been.
Well, when you said that they were shining the torches on it and it lit up from the inside.
Right.
Right, so you're saying that the light actually penetrated through the exterior of this thing?
No. Flashlights were on the figure, and the figure itself was lighting up like a Christmas tree.
Right, okay. So
it lit up, and yeah. I specifically asked Kathleen, I said, so it reacted to you, because this thing was set off to the left. It was at dusk time. It was up against the woods. It was behind this tree. They couldn't get a clear shot of it. They did not use the flashlights at this point because they were not going up there looking for a monster. They were going to look about 100 yards away on top of the mountaintop where the kids had seen it land. So they're looking straight ahead. They're not looking over to their left. This thing completely surprised them. Kathleen May said...
Yeah, they want to save their batteries. Is why they're holding off on their flashlight.
Yeah.
Exactly, Alfred.
And when you know an area, you're not really fearful, are you? So, I walk about in the dark quite a lot, when So,
yeah, and they've been there before. It was no big deal to them.
Yeah, I've done a lot of time walking around Rendlesham Forest on a night, and your torch is off most of the time. So, people would maybe sort of think that, why would you go into the woods without a torch? Well, if you're familiar with an area, then you wouldn't, would you? You'd just be confident just to go off and, do whatever. But, yeah.
So this thing was actually in a dormant state, and they saw the glowing. It was like a low glow from the inside, and they thought it was it was like a dull light. They thought it was something up in a tree, an animal. Gene Lemon, who was standing near her, he thought it was a possum. They're looking 12 feet up in the air. What the hell is going to be 12 feet tall with eyes up in the air? And that's when they hit it. And I said, Kathleen, did this thing react to you? And she says, absolutely. Because when they hit it with the flash beam lights, it reacted, and that's when it lit up, lifted up, and hovered in front of them. This thing was basically hiding up there, and they weren't expecting to see something like that. They're looking straight ahead, like 100 yards to where the thing touched down. This thing completely surprised them.
Yeah.
And they were able to gauge the height because there was this tree limb from that coming off the tree that was 12 feet in the air. About 12 and a half feet, and this thing, when it lifted up and started hovering, just about cleared it. So when the investigators went up there in the following days, they went up there and they said that this is where it was seen. I interviewed Colonel Dale Levitt. He was United States Army in World War II, and he was actually called up to the crash site. He received a call from Washington, and he went up there with about 60 troops. When I went up onto the site with Colonel Levitt and did an interview with him, he told me he distinctly remembered that tree limb they measured was about 12 foot high in the air, and we were standing on the path, and as we got away to the right-hand side of the path, furthest away from the tree, he told me, Frank, we can reach up and we could grab the tip of that tree because it sloped down. He said, so whatever was there came from under the 12-foot point near the tree, came towards the witnesses, and then it moved back away in the other direction and went into the field where the craft was.
And Lieutenant Colonel Dale Levitt, I point out to everybody, is a bona fide World War II hero, decorated hero, with an outstanding reputation in the area.
Yes.
Everyone, after everyone saw that monster and it was all over, I mean, did they all go check their shorts?
Well, Mrs. May told me she was so scared when she saw it. What happened, Guy, is there was actually two fences, and there was a big steel gate, metal steel gate, and that was what separated the farm from the first pasture. The second pasture was the sloping gully, and when they walked inside, it was like a big horse cattle fence, and when they opened that up, they all crossed inside onto the property of the farm, and as they were walking up the dirt path, there was a second fence, but it wasn't a swinging gate. It was actually, Mrs. May said there were two posts, and the posts are actually still there, and they would put slats of wood and nail them from post to post. And the fence was about 3.5 feet high, something like that, about 3.5, 4 feet. Mrs. May said she was so scared when she saw this, it came so close to her, she hurdled it in one shot. On the way up, they climbed over it. Her and the kids climbed over it. On the way back, she says, Frank, we were so goddamn scared, I hurdled that in one shot. The other kids climbed over the fence. When they got back down to the beginning of where the trail began, Guy, they all climbed over. They climbed through. They were so scared they just barely remembered how they got back over and down the hill and back to the house.
Can you guys hear me now?
I got you.
Yeah, we got you, girl.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say that the craft that I saw was pulsing a dull grey-white light and emitting this mist. But when I actually ran for it, I thought that I'd travelled about 200 yards in 3 bionic woman kind of leaps. That fear will give you a height. Yeah.
Raw fear will give you the technology.
I was running and I couldn't see. I was the blind panic thing. I've actually had that. The only thing that I did see was my foot hitting the floor twice, and then I was in the house and I thought I'd done it in 3 giant leaps. Yeah. So, go on, sorry. Carry on
woman
now.
music going. Going in your head. Bionic woman music.
Yeah.
Never mind.
Running in slow motion.
Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't get out there fast enough. It was like being hit by a truck, honestly.
So, I think everybody has a good idea of the wheres and whats and the why-fors of this crazy monster, out there in the middle, the flat, dead center middle of West Virginia. What was this thing?
Well, when I started researching this particular case here, everything I could get my hands on. I spent years researching. I was going to libraries all over West Virginia. I started expanding outside of the Braxton County Monster area. There was a lot of weekly papers up there. I got everything I could get my hands on. I started looking into some of the early research materials of Gray Barker, Ivan Sanderson, and pioneer UFO researcher Donald Kehoe, former Marine. And I started looking over some of their notes and piecing some stuff together. Then what hit me and sent me off into a different direction, Alfred, is when I started finding out the original Flatwoods Monster story didn't hit the news wires until Monday the 15th. The story happened on Friday the 12th of 52. The first article of the Flatwoods Monster actually appeared on the 14th in the Charleston Daily Mail. And it was Ailey Stewart, Jr., who gave the information to the Charleston newspapers. Well, what happened, Guy, is when I started looking into the monster stuff, I started looking at the following morning newspapers. There was no mention of the monster yet because the story hadn't broke yet. But there was articles up and down the East Coast of the United States, and nobody had ever pieced it together, of flying saucers, UFOs, rockets, fireballs, meteors seen up and down the coast. Then I was able to get the Project Blue Book microfilm reel for the same day, September 12th. I started putting together all the locations where these objects were seen, and the story was a lot bigger than just what happened in Flatwoods. I started going into the different regional newspapers of where these sightings were said to have occurred, and I started buying maps and plotting the points. And in the end, I ended up finding out all these different states. It just wasn't West Virginia. I found out there was 21 hours of sustained UFO sightings over 9 East Coast states. They were over Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and West Virginia. And then there was a sighting in California, which is in the new book, some new information, all within a couple-hour time period. So I started pulling out all the Project Blue Book information. I found out Blue Book didn't list Delaware, Ohio, or Tennessee. So I started contacting newspapers and asking them, calling them up around these different states, different regions, and once I found out where one was seen in what area, I would pull the map out and I would call the other local libraries surrounding that area, and before you know it, after several years, I have 102 locations in 9 East Coast states where these UFOs were seen. I work with different people with military backgrounds, and we were able to figure out the flight paths by using the times of these plotted points, what directions, the headings, everything. We put this whole thing together, and we recreated the scenario of what actually happened that night. You're talking about 15 years of work. This didn't happen overnight. It took me over 5 years just to decipher and pull the Project Blue Book documents together, because the process that they were reproduced back in the day, they actually would copy the documents, they would block them out, the masters got locked away, and until the point in time when they were actually photographed to be put on the microfilm, they were sitting around for years, millions of pages of documents, and what happens to the old ink? It starts fading. So by the time they were microfilmed, the ink started fading. Being an illustrator, and I was trained in calligraphy courses at Paier Art School, I was able to sit down and re-ink and go back over all the eyewitness testimonies. That took years just for the one day. And I would put up gigantic blow-ups of a page, like an eyewitness testimony, and you just walk by and
just so you could see what the letter was, right? Just so you could see what the letter was.
Yeah, because these people were writing all this handwritten stuff. They were tentative observers questionnaires. What that means, if you saw a UFO, you would contact the Air Force. They would send you this questionnaire back. You would fill it in and send it back to them. But what happened by the time the Air Force got around to Xeroxing, copying and photographing this stuff from microfilm, they started fading. So you have these half-assed documents that you can barely read. So because of the digital age, I was able to contrast and go back and forth and figure out and blow these documents up where the letters were gigantic, and I was able to figure out what was going on. And that is a good chunk of the information I actually used was from the government.
Yeah, everybody needs to understand, too, Frank, that you're in a situation here where you have 102 data points that singularly, all by themselves, mean absolutely nothing. I mean, you've got Fred and Ethel. Hey, Ethel, get over here and look at this, But he reports it to somebody. He is able to give something a time stamp, a date stamp, and a direction that an object is traveling, right? And when you start getting all those things all put together, they point in specific directions. Am I correct in that, Frank?
That's absolutely what happened, Alfred. And this didn't happen overnight. I was buying small local maps, regional maps, and before you know it, I'm like, holy cow, there's more sightings in this area. And I'm piecing together all of these maps, and in the end, and you can see it on my website, flatwoodsmonster.com. On my homepage, you could click on the master map. You will see the gigantic map. It's the size of a wall that I actually used as the primary piece of recreating what happened that night, and it was quite scary. The Flatwoods monster incident was basically, in a nutshell, a search and rescue operation. I've had military people stand in front of that map and their jaws hit the ground. And one of the original fellows who actually helped me with this, with a military background, he stood in front of that map, and it looked just like 102 bullet holes. And he actually helped me put together and figure out, and he said, Frank, you don't have any idea what you have here. And I said, tell me.
Dun, 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 cue that music. Yeah.
And I says, I have somewhat of an idea. He says, yeah, but look at the flight paths where they're going. And he pulled up one of my big drafting rulers, and we were standing looking in front of this thing, and he says, here, put it here and put it here and put it here. And before you know it, he's starting to tell me all this stuff, and he's like, holy cow, do you realize what happened that night? And he started talking, and Alfred, it fell right into place. And we were able to establish there was 4 damaged objects that were flying over the United States that night. And 3 of these objects actually came over the eastern seaboard. And by plotting all of these points, we were able to establish that the first object that came over the mid-Atlantic part of the United States flew southwest towards Tennessee, and it flew 100 miles through the no-fly zone. It was actually gunning and going towards Oak Ridge National Laboratory. The second UFO that came in over the coast went in the other direction, and it flew northwest towards Ohio, and it flew towards Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. That was a target. The third object that came in came directly down the middle and threaded a needle and flew over Washington, D.C. The New York Times reported it on September 13th. Remember I said the following papers, the newspaper articles were talking about all these different things flying around the United States? It flew over and went over the Capitol and was called the Flame over Washington. When it passed over Washington, D.C., there was a dozen other UFOs that formed an aerial perimeter around it and dropped down out of the sky. It was seen, these objects were seen by thousands of people over the Virginia, Maryland, and Washington area. They just dropped out of the sky, surrounded this damaged object that passed over Washington, basically like they were protecting, like in football, the runner. They put a barricade around them, they protected them, and they were seen moving west. They ascended back up into the sky. This UFO that was damaged, called the Flame over Washington, flew about 200 miles west. It was seen by an airplane over Virginia, and it was seen over several points going into West Virginia. When it hit northern Braxton County on a western trajectory, it turned and headed south and flew towards Flatwoods. So what we have here is 3 damaged crafts coming in. When the object passed over Washington, D.C. safely and was not intercepted and taken out, the other 2 UFOs redirected, the one that was heading towards Oak Ridge and the one headed towards Wright-Pat. We were able to establish the times. The minute that passed over safe, the other 2 turned and went in the opposite directions, and they landed. They were damaged too. So what we have here is 3 damaged objects over the mid-Atlantic. One came in from the Florida direction, and I was able to plot its points, and the majority of information was right in Project Blue Book. Nobody had taken the time to go through the documents, re-ink them, figure out. I was actually pulling my hair out for years trying to figure what happened. And
now you say damaged. We have damaged some kind of aircraft that is damaged, which essentially is written off officially as one meteor lasting 5 or 6 seconds, which actually never really occurred, trying to justify like 21 and a half hours of continuous sighting. Isn't that right, Frank?
Right, and this whole chunk took place here within an hour of what I just described, within an hour. But there was stuff going on all day, before this and after this.
Well, what were witnesses describing when they've seen it, when it was airborne? What were the descriptions? You said it was the fireball. Is that what it looked like? Did it have some kind of like flames coming out of the bottom of it? I've been sort of puzzling over what kind of technology it might have been. So I know they were messing around with anti-gravitics at the time, but it wasn't necessarily that, was it? So what did witnesses actually describe seeing as it was airborne?
The main object, the Flatwoods monster craft, was about 32 feet long. It was shaped like an egg, almost like a football.
Right.
Okay, or a rugby ball. It was an ovoid, and no appendages whatsoever. There were also crafts seen that night that were round. There was all giant round objects. Then there was another object that was described as round with a flat side, like if you set it down, if it was a ball, it would roll. This thing was flat on the bottom side. Then there was several other objects that were huge cigar-shaped objects that were seen flying over the area. And when I started to be an artist, I started drawing sketches of these things and started coloring them in. And then the house started to look like a flying saucer museum because I was doing full-blown paintings, and I was tagging them with Post-its. This one was seen here. This one was seen there. This couldn't have been the same one because it was headed this way and this was headed. So, like I said, this took years to figure out. Then we have an object that was shaped like a top. It was top-shaped, and this thing was gigantic. There was another sighting of a typical flying saucer over that area. Then there was another flying saucer. These things were gigantic, and they were all following All Roads Lead to Flatwoods.
Yeah, Frank, I think what Sasha's getting at, too, is that we say damaged craft, and so these things were making noises. There was molten stuff dripping off of them. They were dropping parts, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there was pieces falling off of them. They were sputtering, making noises. They were exploding, sparks coming off of them. I could give you a couple examples.
Yeah, please.
The thing was variously reported to have made hissing sounds, to have backed up and started over. This thing made putt-putt noises. It had sparkles around it. It was exploding. It was landing. What these things, when they came in, the one differential between, and actually there was 25 UFOs that night. Well, we're going to cut to the chase. I was able to establish there was 25 different UFOs seen over that 21-and-a-half-hour period, and there was a gigantic mothership that was sighted over the coast near Delaware, where witnesses that described it as the size of a dirigible or a Goodyear blimp.
Yeah.
This thing was gigantic, and it was hovering at a low level. During the Cold War, that's not too cool to have stuff the size of a dirigible hovering under 5,000-foot level under radar. At that point, we were anticipating the Soviet Union to bomb us. So,
and was it picked up on radar?
No, it wasn't.
Huh.
They were flying. Back then, our radar was only capable of picking objects from.
Yeah, this is key. Above. This is key. Yeah, key point here.
Yeah, 5,000 feet and above. Under the 5,000 foot, they were flying under radar. Here's another description I'm going to give of one. It appeared to be a very bright light, and it looked as though little pieces fell from it, and it fell right into South Hills. These things had smoke coming off of them, and they were making...
So obviously some fuel source, and then it must have been a proper mechanical thing with the oil and all the probably hydraulic oils, etc.
Yeah, from the monster craft, from the spacesuit. Yeah. And the ones that appeared to be damaged were actually puddle jumping, and they were following the courses of rivers. They were flying over rivers and crashing on nearby banks. They were flying over roads because they were damaged. They were seen going up and down. They weren't consistent on a flat plane. These things were barely clearing the treetops. One of the witnesses up there, and Alfred actually knows, she's passed away now, Margaret Kleiss, who was the mayor of Flatwoods for several years. She took me up to a point on her property a few years ago, and she said, "Frank, look up over there at that tree line." She said, "Years ago when I was a kid, it took several years. That Flatwood ship came in on flames, and the pieces were falling off of it. It was so low, it burned the tops of the trees there, and it took years for that section to grow, have new growth, and come back up." So whatever these objects were, they came and damaged. You want to take over a key point, Alfred? What happened 6 weeks before? At the release of Colonel Montz, the Air Force?
Right. Well, the thing is, taking it all the way back, it's the situation is that it's right before the Flatwood thing was happening at all. There was the biggest flap in United States history. It was called the Summer of Saucers. June, July, and August of 1952. And this is the situation, and you've seen some of the more famous photographs of, they weren't landing on the White House lawn, but I'll tell you what, they were penetrating airspace and flying right over it, right?
Yeah.
So Harry Truman, I figure, decides, like, hey, I want one of these things. It might be kind of cool to have. And so here's the deal, guys. There's a pretty way to say this, but essentially he ordered our military to shoot UFOs down. The orders were shoot them down if they don't follow directions to land. But that's really kind of superfluous and really kind of even stupid to say, don't you think? Like UFOs are going to talk back. No. The orders were to shoot UFOs down.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural show of Citizen Sane. I am Guy Weddle, and I'm here with the illustrious, beautiful, crazy, insane Dr. Christie.
Hello, world! Woo!
Well, finally, huh? Here we
are.
Yeah,
absolutely. Years of procrastination, and we finally did it.
And today we have Frank C. Feschino, Jr. He is the author of The Braxton County Monster. This is a revised edition from 2012. The original, I guess, the publisher fucked up in 2004 or whatever, and I've been reading it, and it is phenomenal. We also have Alfred Lindbergh, who is here with us, and two of my favorite people, one of my most favorite researched cases. It has been, this isn't an armchair research type situation to where somebody goes out on the internet and they just go out and get stuff. Frank went out, was hands-on, walked the walk with the people, took the Air Force clippings, went just really drilled down and spent, 20 years, Frank?
Yeah, closer to 21 now. But, yeah, I spent a lot of time in West Virginia. And I can add, too, that Mr. Lindbergh, within about the first year that I started going into Braxton County, that's when I found out about the Braxton County Monster. Somebody told me through a newspaper article, actually in the Braxton Democrat. And I went into town with my cousin. We were actually on the way going back out of state. And I said, well, let's stop by. It's not that far away. And it was only just a few minutes up the road. And we pulled into the town. And bordering to the right-hand side of the road, there's a gigantic wooden sign, "Welcome to Flatwoods, home of the Green Monster." And I went into the town, tried talking to a couple people. They were kind of standoffish about it. Not too much happened. Then when I got back home to Connecticut, I started looking into this story just out of curiosity. And over the next few months, I started realizing through all the newspaper articles that I was able to find, all the old UFO books and magazines. I was going to libraries all over the state, that this story had really turned into a joke over the years, and there was not two stories in any book that were alike. All the stories were different. I would read one book, and it said Kathleen made a primary witness, and there was 2 kids. There was 5 kids. There was 12 kids. There was, 4 kids. And I'm like, this story is crazy. And then they would talk about the flying saucers and UFO sightings up there, like the guys would talk about on Monday morning talking about the football scores. It was just very common. And I started getting phone calls from my cousin up in Braxton County and some of the other locals about all of these crop circles, rings that were appearing throughout Braxton County, and several of them were on my cousin's farm, right in the area of James Knoll, which was a key part of the Flatwoods Monster incident. But anyways, the stuff is still going on up there today as far as UFO sightings, crop circle rings, and I was actually put in touch with Colin Andrews years ago. I started documenting these crop circle rings. I lived in Connecticut at the time, and Colin came over from England, and we met in Connecticut and sat down for a couple hours. I gave him my video footage that I had taken to the farm and soil samples, different things pieces that he could use for his research. And during the early part of that research, it was just fascinated me seeing this stuff and listening to the stories that the locals were telling me. It was kind of kept inside the community. They didn't talk outside of that community too much about what was going on there. And during that,
the fact that the people, sort of have these really good throwaway excuses, like, oh, it was the 50s, they didn't know what they were looking at. They kind of refer to them as if they were almost of the same intellect as Cro-Magnon man, and it's really not the case, is it? I mean, in the 50s we had all kinds of technology going on, and so, they definitely... if they're going to all describe the same thing in the same way, then there's no mistaking it. I would love to know what it was.
Well, the thing is, Frank's kind of put it together.
Yeah.
Good.
So,
well,
Frank, why don't you take us back from the beginning of why you got involved in the case and that sort of thing? I'm sure you've said this like 1,000 times, but if you could humor our audience.
I have some relatives that live in Braxton County, and at the time actually lived in Frametown, which is about 17 miles away from Flatwoods. And as we'll talk about this a little bit later, Frametown actually came into play during my research. There was another incident that happened the night after the Flatwoods monster incident. But I was up there over 20 years ago, and I was visiting my cousin, and we had a death in the family. I ended up going back up to West Virginia, to Braxton County again. And early on, Guy, I started talking to some of the locals up there and spent some time up in West Virginia with me as well. And he was actually one of the few researchers who actually was on the Bailey Fisher farm and went to the different sites where this occurred. So hats off to Al Lemmer. He's one of the few that has stuck behind me on this whole case over the years.
Yeah, man. Al, how about you still around that meth midget bar down there?
we have to go there, do we? Come on, man.
We got to.
No, I think that place burned down. Actually, there was some crazy bald-headed guy that just went crazy, from what I understand, and he torched the place. But apart from that. Yeah, Joe Nichols was down there. Joe Nichols was down there. But at any rate, I really appreciate Frank's description of me. It's not entirely accurate. I'm certainly not a researcher, but I'll tell you what, I have been up there. I have talked to the people. I've been impressed with their sincerity and their courage and their general intelligence. I mean, they can't be written off as hillbillies when they tell a cogent story and are able to slap a decent sentence together. And like I say, I'm impressed with their sincerity, and it's a hell of a tale.
We actually talked about that the other day, didn't we?